In the hush, before history had a name, when the world was still young enough that every breath felt like the first stirring of creation and every movement carried the weight of eternity. A quiet tension gathered beneath the canopy of Eden, as if the very air sensed that a single choice was about to ripple through the ages and shape the destiny of all who would ever walk the earth. The garden lay in a harmony so complete that even the smallest rustle of leaves felt like a sacred whisper, and Adam and Eve moved through its living beauty with the unguarded ease of those who had never known fear, shame, or the ache of separation. Light filtered through branches heavy with fruit, casting shifting patterns across the soft earth, and the river's gentle murmur wrapped the garden in a sound that felt like peace made audible. Every sense was alive, every moment unbroken, every breath a reminder that they lived in a world untouched by corruption. Yet beneath this serenity, something subtle stirred, a presence that did not belong to the purity of Eden's rhythm. Eve walked near the tree at the garden's center, drawn not by desire but by curiosity, the kind that arises naturally in a world where nothing yet threatens. The serpent watched her with an intelligence that felt out of place, its movements deliberate, its gaze unsettlingly aware. When it spoke, its voice carried a softness that masked its intent, weaving suggestion into the air like a thread meant to pull at the edges of trust. Eve listened, not out of rebellion, but because deception often begins with what sounds harmless, even reasonable. Adam stood nearby, close enough to hear, close enough to intervene, yet caught in the same quiet uncertainty that crept into the moment. The serpent's words pressed gently against the boundary God had set, not with force, but with insinuation, and the garden seemed to hold its breath as Eve's hand hovered near the fruit, the weight of the moment gathering like a storm not yet visible. And as the tension deepens, let your heart stay open to the unfolding of this ancient moment, and if this story stirs something within you, let that reflection guide you to share it with someone who needs its weight and wonder. The fruit hung before her with a quiet stillness, its surface catching the light in a way that made it seem almost alive, as though it waited for her decision with an awareness of its own. Eve's fingers brushed against it, and the coolness of its skin sent a shiver through her, not of fear, but of possibility, the kind that blurs the line between wisdom and desire. The serpent's voice lingered in her mind, its subtle challenge reshaping the command she had always known into something that felt negotiable. As though the boundary God had set was less a warning and more an invitation to explore hidden depths. Adam watched her, his expression caught between trust and hesitation, the garden's silence pressing around them like a witness unable to intervene. The tree stood rooted in the center of Eden, not as a trap, but as a testament to freedom, a reminder that love without choice is not love at all. Yet in this moment, the freedom that had once felt like a gift now carried a weight they had never experienced, a weight that made the air feel thick and the ground beneath them strangely unsteady. Eve lifted the fruit, its stem releasing with a soft snap that echoed louder in her heart than in the garden. She held it for a long moment, the world narrowing to the space between her breath and the decision she had not yet fully understood. When she tasted it, the sweetness spread across her tongue with a richness that felt both exhilarating and unsettling, as though the fruit carried not only flavor, but revelation. She turned to Adam, offering it to him, and he accepted it with a quiet resignation, the kind that comes when the bond between two souls feels stronger than the clarity of a command. As the fruit's taste settled within them, something shifted, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Awareness sharpened, innocence thinned, and the garden's harmony trembled as though creation itself sensed the fracture. And in this tremor lies the doorway into the deeper layers of this story, where ancient cultures, parallel traditions, and archaeological echoes reveal how humanity has long grappled with the mystery of temptation, choice, and the fragile beauty of obedience. Across the ancient Near East, the story of a sacred garden, a boundary set by the divine, and a cunning adversary seeking to fracture the harmony between humanity and the heavens appears in forms that echo the Genesis account with striking familiarity, revealing that the drama unfolding in Eden was not an isolated tale, but part of a broader cultural memory of humanity's earliest struggle with trust, desire, and divine command. In Mesopotamian traditions, the Adapa narrative speaks of a man offered food that could grant life. Yet through deception and misunderstanding, he refuses it, creating a thematic inversion of Eden where the choice still pivots on obedience, mortality, and the tension between divine intention and human perception. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the serpent's theft of the plant of life introduces another resonance, linking serpents with the loss of immortality and humanity's painful awareness of its limits. These parallels do not diminish the uniqueness of Genesis. Instead, they illuminate how the biblical account reframes familiar motifs with profound theological clarity, presenting not a myth of cosmic rivalry, but a deeply moral narrative about relational trust and the cost of fractured communion. Archaeological studies of early Mesopotamian iconography reveal recurring images of sacred trees flanked by human figures and serpents, suggesting that the symbol of a life-giving tree guarded or contested by a serpent was embedded in the cultural imagination long before the biblical text was written. Yet Genesis transforms this imagery, shifting the focus from magical fruit or divine rivalry to the moral weight of choice, portraying the serpent not as a cosmic equal to God, but as a creature whose cunning exploits human vulnerability. The Eden narrative stands apart in its insistence that the heart of the story is not about divine jealousy or lost immortality, but about the rupture of trust, the distortion of truth, and the awakening of a self-awareness that humanity was never meant to bear alone. These ancient echoes, archaeological findings, and literary parallels deepen the gravity of Eden's moment, revealing that the temptation was not merely about a fruit, but about the universal human struggle to discern truth amid subtle deception. And if this unfolding insight stirs something in you, let that reflection move you to pause and share this journey with someone who seeks understanding as deeply as you do. The moment after the fruit was eaten carried a silence unlike any that had ever existed in Eden, a silence not of peace, but of recognition, as though the garden itself recoiled from the shift that had entered its heart. Adam and Eve stood together, yet for the first time they felt apart. Their eyes opened not to divine wisdom, but to the fragile exposure of their own vulnerability. The world around them had not changed, yet everything felt altered. The colors seemed harsher, the air heavier, the once gentle rustle of leaves now carrying an edge that made them aware of their nakedness in a way that pierced rather than freed. They reached for fig leaves with trembling hands, trying to cover what had never needed covering, their movements clumsy with the weight of a shame they could not yet name. As they hid among the trees, the sound of God walking in the garden at the cool of the day stirred a fear they had never known, a fear born not from His presence, but from the distance they had created. The voice that once brought joy now awakened dread, not because it had changed, but because they had. When God called to Adam, the question, "Where are you?" carried not confusion but heartbreak, a divine lament for a relationship fractured by a choice that could not be undone. Adam's answer trembled with a new language of fear, and Eve's voice carried the ache of blame and bewilderment, each word revealing how quickly innocence had unraveled into division. The serpent's triumph was not loud, was quiet, insidious, woven into the subtle shift of trust turned inward, of desire turned against wisdom. And as the consequences unfolded, the garden seemed to mourn, its harmony disrupted, its beauty shadowed by the knowledge that the world would never again be as it had been. Yet, even in this moment of unraveling, there remained a thread of divine intention, a promise whispered beneath the sorrow. And as you sit with the weight of this turning point, let the depth of this ancient moment move you to reflect and, if it resonates, to share this unfolding story with someone who seeks its meaning. Across the ancient world, the idea of a primordial choice, one that reshaped humanity's relationship with the divine, appears in traditions that mirror the Eden narrative with remarkable thematic depth, revealing that the struggle at the heart of Genesis 3 resonated far beyond Israel's borders. In early Mesopotamian lore, the figure of the trickster or deceiver often emerges as a being who disrupts the harmony between gods and humans, not through force, but through cunning persuasion. The Adapa story, for instance, presents a man caught between divine instruction and deceptive counsel, leading to a loss of immortality, not through rebellion, but through a tragic misunderstanding. This parallel highlights a shared ancient intuition that humanity's destiny hinges on the fragile interplay between trust, obedience, and the subtle distortions of truth. In Ugaritic texts, serpents appear as symbols of chaos and boundary breaking, creatures associated with the unraveling of divine order. Their presence in sacred narratives often marks a turning point where the stability of creation is threatened by forces that seek to twist what is good into something destructive. The serpent in Genesis, however, is not a rival deity or cosmic monster, but a creature whose cunning lies in its ability to reshape perception, suggesting that the true battleground of temptation is not external conflict, but internal distortion. This distinction sets the biblical account apart, emphasizing moral agency rather than mythic struggle. Archaeological findings from early Near Eastern sites reveal recurring motifs of sacred trees, divine gardens, and humans placed within them as caretakers, underscoring that the concept of a paradise entrusted to humanity was deeply rooted in the region's cultural memory. Yet Genesis reframes these motifs with a unique theological clarity. The garden is not a realm of divine rivalry, but a space of relational trust, where the boundary set by God is not arbitrary, but protective, designed to preserve the innocence and harmony that defined humanity's earliest moments. These ancient echoes enrich the Eden narrative, revealing that the temptation was not merely a test, but a profound exploration of human freedom, vulnerability, and the delicate balance between desire and obedience. And if this unfolding insight deepens your understanding, let that reflection guide you to share this journey with someone who seeks the same depth of truth. The garden's stillness trembled as God pronounced the consequences of their choice, each word carrying both justice and sorrow, as though creation itself grieved the fracture that had entered its heart. Adam and Eve stood before him, no longer clothed in innocence, but wrapped in the fragile awareness of their own brokenness. Their eyes lowered, not out of defiance, but out of the weight of what they had unleashed. The serpent received its judgment first, its triumph cut short by a prophecy that would echo through the ages, a promise that one day the very deception it had sown would be crushed beneath the heel of a Redeemer yet to come. Eve listened as her own consequences unfolded, the beauty of life now intertwined with pain, the joy of relationship shadowed by struggle. Yet even in this, there was a thread of hope, for through her lineage the promise of restoration would one day rise. Adam heard his judgment with a heaviness that settled deep within him, the ground that once yielded freely, now resisting his labor. The harmony of creation strained by the weight of his choice. Yet even in this moment of loss, God's voice carried not abandonment but a solemn tenderness, as though he mourned with them the world that had been lost. When he clothed them in garments of skin, the gesture spoke of both provision and sacrifice, a quiet foreshadowing of a future redemption that would require far more than the life of an animal. The garden's gate stood open for a final moment, the path behind them glowing with the memory of what once was. And as they stepped beyond its boundary, the world before them felt vast, untamed, and heavy with the unknown. The cherubim took their place, the flaming sword turning in every direction, sealing the garden not out of cruelty but mercy, for to re-enter in their fallen state would have bound them forever to a broken immortality. And as Adam and Eve walked into the unfolding story of humanity, the echo of God's promise lingered like a distant light, a reminder that even in exile, hope had not been extinguished. And if the weight of this moment stirs something within you, let that reflection move you to share this story with someone who seeks its depth and meaning. Across the ancient Near Eastern world, humanity's earliest stories return again and again to the moment when innocence meets deception, when divine intention meets human vulnerability, and when the fragile gift of freedom becomes the stage upon which destiny is shaped. Yet, among all these narratives, the Genesis account stands apart in the clarity with which it reveals not only what happened, but why it matters. In Mesopotamian traditions, the loss of immortality is often portrayed as an accident, a trick of the gods, or a cosmic rivalry in which humans are merely caught between forces beyond their control. But Genesis reframes the entire conversation, presenting a world in which humanity is not a pawn, but a partner, entrusted with a relationship defined by trust rather than fear, and given a boundary not as a limitation, but as a safeguard for flourishing. Archaeological discoveries from early temple complexes and sacred gardens reveal that ancient peoples imagined the divine dwelling in lush, enclosed spaces, places of order set apart from the chaos beyond. These parallels illuminate the cultural backdrop of Eden. Yet, the biblical narrative diverges sharply by placing humanity not outside the divine realm, but within it, invited to walk with God in unbroken fellowship. The rupture that occurs in Genesis 3 is therefore not merely the breaking of a rule, but the breaking of a relationship, a turning inward that distorts perception and reshapes the human heart. The serpent's deception is subtle, not a forceful overthrow, but a quiet reframing of truth, suggesting that the deepest temptations are those that twist what is good into something self-serving, cloaking rebellion in the language of wisdom. The consequences that follow, pain, toil, exile, are not arbitrary punishments, but the natural outworking of a world no longer aligned with its creator. A world where trust has been replaced by suspicion, and where harmony has been fractured by self-determination. Yet even in this moment of loss, the narrative carries a thread of hope woven through the divine words spoken to the serpent, a promise that the wound inflicted in Eden would one day be healed, that the deception which began with a whisper would ultimately be undone by a Redeemer who would confront the serpent not with cunning, but with truth. This promise, ancient and unwavering, reveals that the story of Eden is not merely the account of humanity's fall, but the beginning of humanity's restoration. A reminder that even in the darkest turning, God's intention for redemption remains unbroken. The weight of Eden's story lingers like a quiet echo across the ages, reminding us that the struggle between truth and deception, trust and desire, still shapes the human heart. Yet within that ancient moment lies the first glimmer of a promise that has never faded. And if this journey through the depth and evidence of the story has stirred something meaningful within you, let that reflection move you to share it so others can walk with you into its enduring truth.